Welcome back. In this session, we are discussing the electrolyte balance. Electrolytes are either going to be salts, acids, or bases. When we discuss the electrolyte balance, we usually refer to the salt balance, not the acids and bases. This is going to be regulated by the kidney. But before we discuss how do we regulate the different salts through the kidney, we need first to understand why is it important to have salts in our body fluids. First function of the salts is going to be to control the fluid movements. If you remember, in order for me to move fluid from one fluid compartment to another fluid compartment, we did have two major pressures that will allow this movement to take place. First, the hydrostatic pressure, and second is going to be the osmotic pressure. So what creates the osmotic pressure? What's meant by osmosis? If you remember, osmosis is simply the movement of the water from low solute concentration to a high solute concentration. In other words, what did allow me to move the fluid on here is the difference in the salt distribution. So you see on here, the first function for the salt is to allow the movement of the fluids from one compartment to another. Another function for the salts is the neuromuscular excitability. In any muscle or a nerve cell, in order for it to conduct a signal, if you remember, it's going to be performing an electrical signal, and this signal that it will conduct is going to be the action potential. If you remember, the action potential starts by a depolarization phase in which the membrane will become less negative or more positively charged on the inside. And remember, what allowed me to create this depolarization phase is the influx of sodium. And in order for me to return back to my resting membrane potential, I did need to become negative another time, and this is going to be taking place by the release of another positively charged ion from the inside of the cell to the outside. This was my potassium. So generally speaking, what allowed me to conduct this signal through my muscle cell and my nerve cells is going to be the movement of the different ions, which are salts. Another function for my salts is going to be the secretory activity. They will be controlling the secretory activity of the different cells. So for example, if I am willing to release for example a nutrient, or to reabsorb a nutrient, some of those nutrients gonna be carried along a carrier that won't be working unless it gets attached to a salt, like for example sodium. So you see here, the salts might be critical in the transport of different nutrients. Also, if you remember, at the neuromuscular junction, in order for a nerve cell to conduct the signal to the next cell, it did need to allow calcium in order for it to release the stored acetylcholine. So what enhanced the acetylcholine release from the nerve cell is the entrance of a salt. So you see here, salts are enhancing the secretions. Another function for the salts is going to be to change the membrane permeability. Any membrane permeability is going to be determined according to more than one factor. Some of those factors rely mainly on the presence of the different salts. So for example, if I have a positively charged ion on the outside, it's less likely to travel on the inside if you have too much positively charged ions on the other side of the membrane, compared to if I have negatively charged ions that are trying to get in. They will more likely travel to the inside of the cell because of the presence of positively charged ions on the inside. So you see here, main functions of the salts are going to be they will control the fluid movements, they will allow neuromuscular excitability, allow secretion of the different nutrients, different hormones. Also, they will participate in determining the membrane permeability. Sodium is one of the most important salts that we have in our body fluids. It is the major cation in the extracellular fluid compartment. If you remember, we did have sodium is the major cation on the outside of the cells compared to the potassium is the major cation on the inside of the cells. Sodium exerts a large bulk of the osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid, and thus it will control the water volume and its distribution. Sodium here is representing around 280 milliosmol out of a total osmolarity of 300 milliosmoles. So you see here I'm representing most of the osmolarity. What do you think is meant by I can't change the sodium content, but the concentration of the sodium is going to remain constant? What do you think this means? This simply means that you can add sodium, but once you add sodium, you have water that will follow the sodium. So yes, you can change the amount of sodium, but not the concentration of the sodium. Why again? Because simply sodium controls the water movement between the different fluid compartments. Regulatory mechanisms of the sodium balance. The main hormone here that will control the sodium balance is going to be my aldosterone. If you remember, the aldosterone is a hormone that is getting released from the adrenal cortex. If you remember, the adrenal cortex was formed of 3 layers: my zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Zona glomerulosa is going to be the layer responsible for the secretion of aldosterone, and the aldosterone main function is to allow the reabsorption of the sodium back from the distal convoluted tubules and my collecting ducts. If you see on here, how important is the aldosterone here in terms of the water regulation? See, 65% of the water is going to get reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules, and this is a mandatory water reabsorption. It's going to take place anyways. As well as 25% will be reclaimed in the ascending loops of Henle, where I did have free water reabsorption. So both together on here, the amount of water that will be reabsorbed in the proximal convoluted tubules as well as the water reabsorbed in the loop of Henle, those will make together around 90% of the water that was filtered in the kidney tubules. The remaining 10% is going to be reclaimed back if needed in my distal convoluted tubules and my collecting ducts, which is partly going to be under the influence of the aldosterone when it's high. When the aldosterone is high, it's going to be stimulating the cells to reabsorb the sodium back to the blood, and again, sodium when reabsorbed, it's going to get followed by water. If you remember, how did I stimulate the adrenal cortex to release the aldosterone? If you remember, kidney detects any drop in the blood pressure through the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And if you remember, the juxtaglomerular apparatus was formed of 3 types of cells: granular cells, macula densa, and my extraglomerular mesangial cells. If you remember, the granular cells acted as mechanoreceptors. They will detect the degree of stretch, and whenever I have a drop in the blood pressure, I will have less stretch to the wall of my vessels. This drop in the blood pressure will stimulate the cells to release hormone, which is called my renin. Remember, renin activates angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Then angiotensin 2, one of its functions, it was to stimulate the adrenal cortex to release aldosterone, and the aldosterone will enhance the distal convolute tubule cells to enhance the sodium reabsorption. And if you remember, sodium reabsorption here will let you retain water. Again, what percent of the water can be retained under the effect of aldosterone is going to be around 10%, because 65% is going to be reclaimed in the proximal convoluted tubules, 25% is going to be reclaimed in my loop of Henle. So aldosterone here brings its effects slowly within hours to days. So it's not a fast way to respond to drop in the blood pressure. It's a long-term regulation of the blood pressure rather than a short-term regulation. So you might be willing to constrict the blood vessels in order to have a faster response to the drop in the blood pressure. And this was actually one of the functions of angiotensin 2. If you remember, first functions that we've discussed was constriction of the arterioles. This would increase the total peripheral resistance. In the same time, the angiotensin 2 will be stimulating the release of aldosterone that will bring its effects within hours to days. How would I be regulating sodium in case of high blood pressure? So in case of low blood pressure, we're going to be stimulating the juxtaglomerular apparatus, especially the granular cells, to release the renin. Renin activates the adrenal cortex. The adrenal cortex releases aldosterone, enhancing sodium reabsorption. But how would I regulate the sodium reabsorption and secretion in case of high blood pressure? So if you remember, the organ that hates high blood pressure is the heart. Remember, heart doesn't want to have lots of pressure that it needs to overcome in order to pump the blood out. If I have hypertension, lots of pressure that needs to get overcome in order to pump the blood out of the ventricle. So the heart here hates having high afterload. So this makes perfect sense when we look here on how to regulate the sodium balance in case of hypertension or having an increase in the blood pressure. So my heart, especially here my atrium, will be releasing a hormone that we call the atrial natriuretic peptide. What do you understand from just the name, atrial natriuretic peptide? First thing I can understand is that it's gonna be released from the atrium, and it has a protein in nature. It's a peptide. But what is meant by natriuretic? Natriuretic. So you see on here, what is the atomic symbol of carbon? It's a C, right? What is the atomic symbol of oxygen? It's an O. What is the atomic symbol of, let's say, nitrogen? And helium, He. Hydrogen, H. Sodium, it's an Na. You see on here, where did we get the Na from? Actually, the atomic symbol of the different elements, those are not the first letter or two letters of the English name of the element. Those are the first letter or two letters of the Latin name. And sodium is called natrium, actually. So this makes sense on here when we look at the name of this hormone. It's natriuretic. I am doing what to the sodium? Natri here, I mean natrium, and uretic means the release in the urine. So What I can understand here just from the name is that it's a peptide, it's a protein in nature, it's going to be released from the atrium, and it acts by releasing sodium in the urine, natriuretic. But actually it's more complex than this, so let's look on here together. Natriuretic peptide will have more than one target organ. So it acts first on the kidney. To be more specific, the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney. I don't want to increase the blood pressure, so I will be inhibiting the renin release from the juxtaglomerular apparatus. And if you don't have renin, what's going to happen to the angiotensin II? Remember, I can't get angiotensin II without having renin, so a drop in the renin release from the juxtaglomerular apparatus will result in a drop in the angiotensin II. Drop in the angiotensin II, from its name, if you remember, angio means blood vessel and tensin means tension, so you are constricting the vessels. So if I don't have the hormone that constricts the vessels, so what do you think gonna happen to the vessels? If I don't have something to constrict, they will dilate. And exactly this is what's gonna happen. I will get vasodilation of the vessels in case of reduction of the active angiotensin II. Look on here. If I have a reduction in the tension of the wall of those vessels, how is this going to affect my blood pressure? If you remember, mean arterial pressure equals to cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. If I did dilate the vessels, I have a reduction in my resistance. If you reduce the resistance, again, as the blood flows, this will directly decrease your mean arterial pressure. So the blood pressure decreases back to normal, and this is what I want. So again, the first mode of action of atrial natriuretic peptide would be to inhibit the juxtaglomerular apparatus of the kidney, resulting in the reduction of the release of renin. Reduction in the renin release will cause a reduction in the availability of angiotensin II, and a reduction in the levels of angiotensin II will result in vasodilation of the arterioles. Remember, vasodilation of the arterioles will result in a reduction in my total peripheral resistance, reducing my blood pressure back to normal. Another target organ that the atrial natriuretic peptide going to be affecting is going to be the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary gland. If you remember, hypothalamus was releasing a hormone called ADH that gets released from the posterior pituitary gland. And remember what it was a function of ADH. I am an anti-diuretic hormone. I am preventing diuresis. I am preventing water loss in the urine. And if I prevent water loss in the urine, what's going to happen? This water that was supposed to get released out in the urine will be retained in the blood, causing an increase in the blood volume. Once the blood volume is increased, this will increase the pressure. Remember, if I have here a reduction in the ADH, what's going to happen? No retention of the water will be taking place in my collecting ducts. No retention of water from the collecting ducts. This means that the water will get released out in the urine. And if you lose the water out in the urine, what's going to happen to your blood volume? As a result, blood volume will decrease. Reduction in blood volume will result in reduction in its pressure. So again, let me review this. Another target organ for atrial natriuretic peptide would be the hypothalamus. Normally, hypothalamus releases ADH. ADH release will be responsible to increase the blood volume by preventing the loss of fluid in the urine. If I did decrease the ADH release, this will directly affect the collecting ducts and will prevent them from allowing the water to be reabsorbed back into my blood vessels. Not reabsorbing the water back into the vessels, this means that this water will pass to the outside of the body in the urine, and as a result I will get a reduction in my blood volume. This reduction in the blood volume will directly cause a reduction in the blood pressure. Another target organ that ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide, is going to be acting on is going to be the adrenal cortex. And one major hormone here that we are discussing related to the sodium regulation and body fluid regulation was the aldosterone. ANP will be inhibiting the adrenal cortex, causing the reduction of the release of aldosterone. This reduction of the aldosterone release will be preventing the kidney tubules from retaining sodium. If I'm not reabsorbing the sodium back, what's going to happen? The sodium is going to travel to the outside in the filtrate and will get released in the urine. And remember, what usually follows the sodium is going to be water. So if you did not reabsorb the sodium, sodium gets released out through the kidney tubules in the urine and is going to be followed by water. If you release water out in the urine, you are going to be reducing the blood volume. And remember, when you reduce the volume, you reduce the pressure. Moving on to other hormones that will affect the sodium and fluid balance. This includes the estrogens. Estrogens will have a similar effect to the aldosterone. They will enhance the sodium reabsorption. And this explains why some females will have swelling during menstrual cycles and during pregnancy. Why? Because this retained sodium on here gonna be retained and it's gonna be followed by water. This water retention might cause edema of the legs, for example. Another hormone that will have a similar effect to the aldosterone, enhancing the sodium reabsorption, is going to be the corticosteroid. Corticosteroids or glucocorticoids, those are going to promote edema. If you remember, what are the different layers of the adrenal cortex? Adrenal cortex was formed of 3 layers: zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, and zona reticularis. Zona glomerulosa was responsible to release the mineralocorticoids like my aldosterone. Zona fasciculata was responsible to release the glucocorticoids, cortisols. And the zona reticularis was responsible to release my gonadocorticoids like the androgens that will get transformed into estrogens later on. So if you notice on here, aldosterone is enhancing the reabsorption of sodium, causing water retention and edema. Glucocorticoids, cortisol, is going to enhance the sodium reabsorption, promoting edema. Gonadocorticoids are going to be enhancing the sodium retention and promoting edema. So you see on here, this gives me an idea why estrogens and the glucocorticoids are going to enhance the sodium reabsorption. They all are going to get released from the adrenal cortex, and they will have similar chemical characteristics. On the other hand, a hormone that reduces the sodium reabsorption is going to be the progesterone, and it actually reduces the sodium reabsorption by blocking the aldosterone. So if we're looking at a menstrual cycle, in the first half of the menstrual cycle, I have an increase in the levels of the estrogen compared to on the second half of the menstrual cycle, I will have an increase in the levels of the progesterone released. So this explains why females during the first half of the menstrual cycle might experience edema in the legs, for example, due to the sodium retention under the effect of the estrogen. And this edema will subside during the second half of the menstrual cycle. This is going to be under the effect of the progesterone. Another very important ion that we are looking at its regulation in this chapter is going to be the calcium ion. Calcium in the extracellular fluid is important because it's going to be regulating the neuromuscular excitability. If you remember, one of the major activities of the calcium that we did discuss back with the heart was that it is responsible for the plateau phase of the action potential of the cardiac muscle cells. If you remember, in order for the cardiac muscle cells to depolarize, I did allow the sodium influx of sodium, and in order for me to repolarize, I did allow the potassium out. But in order for me to increase the time needed for the repolarization to take place, I did allow the calcium out in the same time for me to create this plateau phase. So you see on here, the presence of calcium was so important for the cardiac muscle cells to create more time in order for it to relax and to refill the heart with blood. Another example of how important the calcium was important to the neuromuscular excitability was at the neuromuscular junction. If you remember, at the neuromuscular junction, the terminal ends of the nerve fibers, once they receive the electrical signal down, they will open voltage-gated calcium channels, and the calcium that enters the terminal button of the nerve fiber is what stimulates the release of the neurotransmitters stored in the vesicles. And those neurotransmitters will be responsible to conduct the signal to the muscle cell. So you see on here, calcium did play a major role in the conduction of the signal from one nerve cell to another and from one nerve cell to a muscle cell. So I play a very important role in terms of a neuromuscular excitability. Also, as we're going to be discussing in the blood chapter, we're going to see that calcium is highly important for the activation of the coagulation factors, which are going to be needed to form a blood clot. So without having normal amounts of calcium in the blood, I may be at a risk of bleeding, excessive blood loss. Another function of the extracellular fluid calcium is going to be to regulate the cell membrane permeability. If I don't have enough calcium on the outside, I will be losing the ability to control the entrance of other positively charged and negatively charged ions across the membrane. And as we mentioned earlier, the calcium plays a major role in the secretory activities. Regulation of the calcium. If I do have low calcium level in the blood, this is what we call hypocalcemia. You see on here, emia is blood, and this would be my calcium, and hypo means low. So what is meant by hypocalcemia? This is low blood calcium levels. Having low blood calcium level, this would increase the excitability of my nerve cells and muscle cells. When you increase the excitability of the muscle cells, they will be kept in a continuous contraction. This is what we call tetany. Another function for another homeostatic imbalance that would be related to the blood calcium level is having too much calcium in the blood, which is hypercalcemia. Having too much calcium outside in the extracellular fluid, this will inhibit the neurons and muscle cells and may cause heart arrhythmia. So let's see on here, in order for a nerve cell to conduct an electrical signal, an action potential, it needs to allow the sodium in. If I have too much calcium on the outside, it might be competing with the sodium and having repulsion with the sodium ions, reducing its ability to get into my cells. So this will be inhibiting the nerve cells and muscle cells. Also, it's going to be interfering with the exit of calcium if I have too much with the exit of potassium to the outside of the cells. And this will result in heart arrhythmias. Same concept on here like what we've seen with the nerve and skeletal muscle cells. Calcium balance is controlled by the parathyroid hormone, PTH, and calcitonin. If you remember, PTH is going to be released from 4 tiny glands that were located on the dorsal aspect of the thyroid glands. Those are my parathyroid glands. And the main function on here for the PTH was to increase the blood calcium level. PTH did increase the blood calcium level by 3 major excuse me, 3 major mechanisms. First one is going to be the resorption of the bone. And remember, resorption of the bone means you're breaking down the bone tissue to release the calcium. And this is going to be taking place under the effect of special cells located in the bones. Those are called my osteoclasts. So PTH activates osteoclasts to break down the bones, and this will cause the release of the calcium out into the blood. Another function for the PTH is to prevent this calcium from getting released into the urine by stimulating the reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubules, as we've mentioned earlier. Another function here for PTH is to promote the activation of vitamin D. And remember, vitamin D is essential for me to absorb the calcium from my intestines. So a third function here of PTH is to stimulate the absorption. So 3 functions for PTH by which it will increase the blood calcium levels. First is going to be resorption, second is going to be reabsorption, and the third one is going to be by enhancing the absorption. So resorption, reabsorption, and absorption, those are the 3 mechanisms by which PTH increases your blood calcium levels. So what hormone is released when blood pressure is too high? Would you release renin? No. Why? Renin converts angiotensinogen into angiotensin 1 that becomes activated into angiotensin 2 that increases my blood pressure. So actually I will be releasing renin in case of low blood pressure, not high blood pressure. Angiotensin 2 increases the blood pressure by 5 different means. Constriction of the arterioles is a major one of them. And aldosterone, if you remember, it enhances the sodium reabsorption. And again, when you reabsorb the sodium, it's going to be followed by water. When you reabsorb larger amounts of water, this increases your blood volume. And once you increase the blood volume, the blood pressure will go up. So none of the 3 on here, neither A, C, or D, will reduce the blood pressure to get released in case of high blood pressure. On the other hand, my ANP, my atrial natriuretic peptide, is going to be released in case of high blood pressure. Remember, ANP is going to be acting on juxtaglomerular apparatus, my hypothalamus, and my adrenal cortex. Can you remind me of the action on each of them? In the juxtaglomerular apparatus, I will reduce renin release. In the hypothalamus, I would be reducing ADH release, and on the adrenal cortex, I would be reducing the aldosterone release. Alright, so the only one on here that gets released in case of high blood pressure is going to be my atrial natriuretic peptide. Alright, so next session we are going to be discussing the acid-base balance. Thank you.